Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the One More Book podcast. My name is Florence, and thank you for joining me again. If you're new here, hi. I talk about literature, and if you like this kind of video, if you like literature, if you like reading diversely, if you're looking for book recommendations, please don't forget to comment, like, and of course subscribe. But if you're a regular subscriber, thank you so much for joining me again. So this was a special episode that I had hoped and planned to share during Women's History Month. That was in March. We are currently in April. But yeah, life happened. We're in April. Things came up, but I knew that I was going to still post it even if it was late, because we do not have to do things according who chooses a timeline for us to follow. So this is my channel. I am going to do things according to my own timeline. So better late than never. So in this episode, I have decided to really highlight Kenyan women authors, Kenyan women writers who contributed so much to African literature in the during colonial time and post-colonial times. So when we talk about African women in literature, we often hear names like Mariama Ba, who was a Senegalese author. We hear about Ama Ataido, a Ghanaian, amazing author from Ghana, and of course Tsitsi Dangarembga, and rightfully so. I even have books by them. This is Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. This is Changes by Ama Ataido, and of course, So Long a Letter by Mariama Ba. And of course, they are important writers. They are important voices that we listen to, and we continue to encourage more people to read. But I've also noticed how some women whose contributions to African literature are just as powerful, but somehow they don't make the same lists. You know, when people list like, these are the African literature women authors that you need to read, they do not make these lists. And especially me being a Kenyan, I felt like I could start at home. Charity begins at home. So today I want to shine a light on some Kenyan women writers whose contribution to African literature, who has really preserved culture. They have challenged systems. They've built literature houses. They've built literature spaces. They've paved the path for the younger generation, and they've told stories that have influenced a lot of generations. And they have told stories that have shaped the future of several generations. And of course, the impact of their work is still being felt, and I feel like deserve more recognition than it gets. So first and foremost, I will start with Professor Wangari Maathai. I have her book here, her memoir, which is called Unbowed: One Woman's Story. And Professor Wangari Maathai was born in 1940 in, I believe, in Nyeri district, and she was one of 300 Kenyans who were selected to go and study in the US as part of a project called Airlift Africa, which it was an initiative that was proposed by Tom Mboya. Tom Mboya was one of the earliest leaders of post-colonial Kenya, and it was funded through the John F. Kennedy Jr. Foundation in 1960s. So they chose 300 of the best, youngest minds that they could get, and she was one of them. So later she went on she did her degree, her master's, and even came to study in Germany. And she later earned her PhD, becoming the first ever woman in East and Central Africa to receive a doctorate. And in 1977, she founded the Green Belt movement. She saw how deforestation was making life harder for rural women. She was a real champion of women's rights. So planting trees became a way to protect the land while also supporting women's livelihoods, because they could now have more time. They didn't have to go far to go and fetch firewood. And of course, it made their lives a bit more simpler, and they could also earn money, but of course also protect the environment and water. we all know the benefits of planting trees. But the more she worked, the more she realized that environmental problems were really, really tied to political ones. Land was being misused. Public spaces were under threat. They were being grabbed by these really, really corrupt politicians, and ordinary people had very little power against such syndicates, I would say syndicates. So her activism expanded into fighting for democracy, human rights, and government accountability. All these you can read in her memoir, where she explains each and every fight that she fought. And she really fought tooth and nail for freedom of women, of human rights, or protecting the environment. She really did her best. This really made her go at loggerheads with the president of Kenya at that time, the late President Moi, who she publicly challenged. She challenged him, she challenged his regime, she protested the destruction of public parks. These were all being grabbed. The forest, like Uhuru Park, there's a park in Nairobi that is referred to as Uhuru Park. They wanted to grab that. Karura Forest, which even right now, they are still trying to grab. She supported political prisoners and, of course, pro-democracy protests. She was always there. She was arrested, she was beaten, she was harassed because of it. She was called everything but then the child of God. She was given all these names. But she persisted. She also wrote, of course, books like the memoir that I mentioned, Unbowed, The Challenge for Africa, where she reflected on her activism, on leadership, and of course, on justice. And in 2004, she became the first African woman to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize, which just went on to show that protecting the environment is deeply, deeply connected to peace and human dignity. And a fun fact is, of course, that she was in Germany. That was something that when I read it, it just brought joy to my heart, because she was here in pursuit of her doctorate, and in 2 universities, one in Gießen and the other one in Munich. An amazing, amazing lady. The next female author that I want to highlight is Dr. Pamela Kola, who was born in 1943 in Western Kenya. And she grew up surrounded by Luo storytelling, traditional storytelling that we used to listen to when our grandparents, after dinner, you'd sit next to your grandparents and they would tell us these folk tales that are passed down from elder to elder, and this became the foundation of her work. And in the late 1960s, she started publishing books like East African Why Stories and How Stories and When Stories, where she took traditional myths and turned them into books for children. And this was a really big shift, as these children were finally seeing themselves in these stories. They were finally seeing their own cultures, the animals that they know, and even traditions as they were reading these books. She was also an educator, and in this way she could test her stories on the children that she was teaching. She used them in classrooms, and of course she pushed for African folktales to be part of the school curriculum. And beyond that, she broke barriers as one of the first African teachers at Kenya High School, which at the moment is one of the national schools. It's a girls' school, and later worked in early childhood education using storytelling as a tool for learning and of course also for identity. Dr. Pamela Kola's work is all about preserving oral traditions while also making them accessible and bridging that gap between storytelling and formal education. And as a female writer in post-colonial Kenya, she navigated significant challenges, including patriarchal gatekeeping in publishing, which is still happening even now, limited opportunities for children literature due to high production costs and preferences for textbooks over fiction, and of course, the marginalization within a male-dominated industry. The next author is Muthoni Likimani, who was born in 1926 in Murang'a County. And she grew up in a very influential household where her father was one of the first Anglican ministers in the country. She became a teacher before undertaking further studies in Israel and also in the UK. She had a career, a very mixed up, a very vibrant career, because she was a broadcaster, she was an actress, she was a publisher, she was Kenya's first beauty queen, and actually went on to become the first African to establish a PR firm in Kenya, and it was known as Noni's Publicity Company. But what really stands out is her connection to the Mau Mau struggle, which was the freedom fight against colonialism, where she secretly passed letters between detainees and their families, literally risking her safety and of course her life. Her book, which is referred to as NF 47927, is especially powerful as it tells the story of women during the Mau Mau fight for independence. And it shows how they also resisted and survived in everyday life, you know, because I think when it comes to the fight against colonialism and freedom fight, we always hear about the men, but also the women were also there. They're just not talked about. She also went ahead to write novels like They Shall Be Chastised and What Does a Man Want? And beyond writing, she was also a women's rights activist, even going ahead to become Nairobi's city councillor and later being recognized internationally for her leadership skills. Rebecca Njau, born in 1932 in Kiambu, Kenya, grew up in the really interesting space between Christian beliefs at home and traditional practices in her community. And that tension really shows up a lot in her work. She didn't just write, she literally made history. She was Kenya's first female playwright ever. Her play, which is titled The Scar, written in 1963, tackled female genital mutilation in a way that was really bold, controversial, and honestly unheard of at that time. Then there is, of course, her novel Ripples in the Pool, and this one really stands out because it follows a complex female character who is navigating independence, relationships, and identity, and it even explores same-sex desire, which was very incredibly groundbreaking, especially for African literature in the 1970s. And what makes her writing so powerful is that she wasn't afraid to go into uncomfortable topics like patriarchy, women's roles, sexuality, cultural expectations, and she really went in and questioned them. She also worked as a teacher and helped found a girls' school and was really involved in Kenya's creative scene. So her impact goes way beyond just books. Also, fun fact, she's the auntie of Binyavanga Wainaina, who was a really amazing Kenyan author, and her daughter, Hannah Njau Okola, is also a poet and an author. So storytelling really runs in the family. Michere Githae Mugo is one of those writers whose life story feels just as powerful as her work. She was born in 1942 into a family that was deeply involved in the fight for independence. So activism was part of her foundation right from the beginning. She went on to become a professor and even the first female dean at the University of Nairobi. But what really shaped her life was her political activism. She was outspoken about human rights abuses under the President Moi's government, and because of that, she was harassed, arrested, and eventually forced into exile in 1982. She had to leave Kenya with her young daughters, and at that point, she was even stripped of her citizenship. But that didn't stop her. Even in exile, she kept teaching, writing, and organizing as she lived and worked in Zimbabwe, and much later in the US. She continued advocating for justice, for women's rights, and African identity on a global level. And you can really see all that in her writing. Her play, The Trial of Dedan Kimathi, which she co-wrote with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, is about resistance against colonial rule, while her poetry collections like Daughter of My People, Sing and My Mother's Song carry really great themes about struggle, identity, and resilience. She also wrote works like Writing and Speaking from the Heart of My Mind and The Imperative of Utu and Ubuntu, where she explores what it really means to be human and to be connected to others, what it means to be in community with others. Her writing is deeply rooted in African tradition, but also shaped by Pan-Africanism and feminist perspectives. So she's constantly connecting culture, identity, and justice. Charity Washiuma is alongside Grace Ogot, who is also a very popular, well-known Kenyan female author, as one of the first Kenyan women ever to be published in English. She grew up in colonial Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, which was a really intense and violent time. And that experience shows up in her work in such a personal way. Like her book, Daughter of Mumbi, which is basically her story told through the eyes of a young Kikuyu girl trying to make sense of everything that is happening around her. A colonial rule, fear, loss, even her own father was killed during this period. But she didn't just write heavy political stories. She also wrote for younger readers books like Mweru, The Ostrich Girl, and The Golden Feather, which are rooted in Kikuyu storytelling traditions. So they're almost like folktales that are passed down through generations. And what makes her stand out is how she was able to bring culture and real life experiences together. She even wrote about sensitive topics like traditional practices which affect women way before people were even openly having these conversations. She wasn't just writing to tell stories. She wrote to preserve memory and culture and to tell people what it felt like to grow up in that time. Jane Tapsubei Kraida grew up in Kenya in the 1940s with a traditional Nandi upbringing near Lake Victoria, which is on the west of Kenya. And she was surrounded by culture, community, and ancestral traditions. But at the same time, she was also educated by Christian missionaries. And this mix really shaped her entire life and, of course, her writing too. Her memoir, Two Lives, My Spirit and I, really captures her experience on moving from Kenya to North America, where she currently lives, and how it is navigating a completely different culture and trying to balance a traditional identity rooted in family and spirituality with a more individual Western way of life. She also didn't limit herself to one kind of writing. She wrote fiction like The Shrunken Dream and even worked on linguistic books that's actively preserving her language and culture too. I think she even wrote a Nandi dictionary, which I think is amazing. Grace Emily Ogot wasn't just a writer. She was a nurse, she was a journalist, she was a politician, she was a diplomat. She was born in Asembo in 1930 and grew up listening to Bible stories from her father and, of course, traditional Luo folktales from her grandmother. And this mix shaped her powerful storytelling. She was one of the first Anglophone female writers ever to be published, and her stories blend tradition with modern life, exploring culture, womanhood, and identity, often set around Lake Victoria. She faced rejection at first by publishers who didn't expect a Christian woman to write about African traditions, but she proved them wrong. Some of her most popular works include The Promised Land, which is about migration, culture, clashes, and chasing a better life. Another one is Land Without Thunder, which is a collection of short stories that are inspired by Luo traditions. Another one of her famous books is The Strange Bride, which is deeply rooted in folklore and in culture. And honestly, she's one of those writers who quietly changed everything, and more people really, really need to know more about her. Asenath Bole Odaga was born in 1938 in Nyanza, and education and storytelling played a really, really big part in her life. And because of that, she did not only write books, but she also built systems around them. In 1982, she founded Lake Publishers, becoming the first woman ever in East Africa to run a publishing house. That is in 1982. And this was really, really huge because she created opportunities for Kenyan writers, especially for women and those writing in local language and those trying to actually get published. She also went ahead to establish an independently owned bookshop, which was called Thutinda in Kisumu, which went this created a space where young writers and local language authors could come together and bring their work, share ideas, and have real conversations about writing. She was also deeply invested in oral literature. She studied it, she wrote about it, and she pushed for it to be taken seriously in education, helping preserve Kenya's storytelling traditions. She also co-founded the Kenya Women Literature Group to support writing in indigenous languages, making sure that literature wasn't just for a small and elite audience. And as a writer herself, she published over 50 books, children's stories, novels, and educational texts because she believed that Kenyan readers, especially children, deserved to see their own cultures, their own language, and everyday lives reflected in the books that they read. So in conclusion, I hope that I have at least piqued your interest into reading a bit more about these African women authors, apart from the ones that we already know, and at least widen your libraries and try and find these books because they exist, because these authors also existed, and what they've done for literature in Africa is just amazing. And we need to keep their names in our mouths. Looking at all these women together, I realized that they just didn't write books. They preserved history, they created space, they challenged power, and made African stories, especially women's stories, told. And they made sure that these stories were carried further. Even when they are not here, we still read their stories and hear about their experiences. And even just how connected literature is to activism. I absolutely love that. And this list is not complete. Let us all expand on it. Let us add more names on it and read more from these authors. There are so many, but of course, if you know any, please let me know in the comment section. I think I want to do other parts of Africa, but I felt like I had to start home. But of course, if you have any recommendations, let me know in the comment section. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share if you found these educative or informative. And of course, see you in my next video. And yeah, bye-bye.